Claire Bennett had spent her entire life trying to earn a kind of love that always seemed to come with conditions. Inside the Bennett family, success was never about happiness, loyalty, or sacrifice. It was about image. Her father, Richard Bennett, was a powerful attorney in Naples, Florida, a man obsessed with reputation, status, and control. Every dinner conversation felt like a competition disguised as family bonding. Claire's older sister was celebrated as the perfect doctor, elegant and admired by society. Her younger brother worked in finance and represented everything Richard believed a successful son should become. And then there was Claire, the daughter who chose the military. To outsiders, serving her country sounded honorable. But inside her own home, it was treated like a disappointing detour. Her father constantly reminded her that she could have become something greater if she had entered politics, corporate law, or high finance. He didn't understand military service because it couldn't be measured by country club status or magazine covers. Over time, Claire stopped trying to explain herself. She learned that some people only support dreams they personally recognize. Even after years of sacrifice, intelligence work, and overseas deployments, her achievements were quietly ignored during family gatherings. Photographs of her siblings decorated the walls of her parents' mansion, while pictures of Claire were almost impossible to find. The absence spoke louder than words ever could. Still, she kept showing up. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of her hoped that one day her father would finally look at her with pride instead of disappointment. But the harder Claire worked to prove herself, the clearer it became that the issue was never her lack of success. The real problem was that she succeeded in a way her family could not control. Richard Bennett wanted obedience more than understanding. He wanted a daughter who fit neatly into the version of life he had already designed. Claire, however, had become someone entirely different, disciplined, independent, emotionally guarded, and far stronger than anyone realized. What nobody in that family understood was that while they spent years underestimating her, Claire had quietly been building a life far beyond their imagination. Behind the silence, behind the military uniforms and long absences, she was creating something powerful. And soon the same people who dismissed her would be forced to confront the truth. The daughter they called a disappointment was about to become the most respected person in the room. If this story already has you hooked, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because what happened next completely changed the Bennett family forever. The moment Richard Bennett slammed his hand against the dining table, the entire room froze. Crystal glasses trembled, silverware stopped moving, and 22 guests suddenly became silent witnesses to the kind of humiliation families spend years pretending never happened. Claire Bennett stood near the far end of the table, still wearing the calm expression she had learned to carry through military briefings and overseas deployments, but inside something was beginning to crack. The dinner had started like every other Bennett family gathering: expensive wine, polished smiles, carefully measured compliments, and endless conversations about status. Claire's older sister had been praised once again for her medical career. Her younger brother proudly described another financial victory in New York. Their father smiled through every story because those accomplishments reflected the version of success he understood. But when his attention finally turned toward Claire, the atmosphere changed immediately. Richard leaned back in his chair and asked the question everyone at the table already knew was not really a question at all. "What exactly is your long-term plan?" The room went still. Claire calmly explained that she intended to continue serving in military intelligence, believing her work mattered. But her father laughed softly under his breath, as if her answer embarrassed him. He told her she was wasting her life collecting a government paycheck when she could have joined elite law firms, corporate leadership, or politics. Then came the sentence that hit harder than anything else. "You're not a child anymore," he snapped. "You need to stop playing soldier." Claire felt her heartbeat slow, not from fear, but from anger so deep it became cold. She thought about the sacrifices she had witnessed overseas, the soldiers who never returned home, the folded flags handed to grieving families. To her, military service was never a game. But to Richard Bennett, it was simply a disappointing choice that failed to elevate the family name. Claire tried to remain calm, but the tension at the table thickened with every second. Her mother lowered her eyes instead of defending her. Her sister quietly sipped wine in silence. Her younger brother looked trapped between guilt and fear. And then Richard stood up. His face hardened, his voice sharper than before. "If you refuse to take this family seriously," he said, pointing toward the front door, "then get out." Nobody moved. Nobody protested. The silence that followed felt even crueler than the words themselves. Claire slowly rose from her chair while every guest avoided eye contact. She could feel humiliation burning through her chest, but she refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Step by step, she walked toward the exit while thunder rolled outside across the Florida sky. Just before she reached the door, her father delivered one final sentence. "And don't come back." Claire paused for half a second, gripping the handle tightly, fighting the urge to turn around and ask why she was never enough for him. But she already knew the answer. Richard Bennett only respected versions of success he could control. So, instead of arguing, Claire opened the door and walked out into the storm alone, unaware that this painful night was about to become the greatest turning point of her entire life. If you think Claire's father went too far, comment the number 2 below. Because what happened after this dinner shocked everyone who once underestimated her. Claire Bennett could have survived her father's anger. What nearly destroyed her was the silence of everyone else in the room. As she stood beside the dining table, with rain pounding against the windows outside, she slowly realized that not a single member of her family was willing to defend her. Not her mother, who spent years pretending cruelty was simply good manners. Not her older sister, who lowered her eyes into her wine glass the moment the argument became uncomfortable. Not even her younger brother, whose face filled with guilt, but whose mouth never opened. And perhaps worst of all, not her grandfather Walter, the retired Marine who once taught her that courage mattered more than approval. In that moment, Claire understood something painful about family's betrayal is rarely loud. Most of the time it arrives quietly through people choosing comfort over loyalty. Richard Bennett remained standing at the head of the table, like a judge delivering a final sentence. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside the room, but nobody moved to stop him. Claire looked around slowly, at the faces surrounding her. Some guests stared at their plates. Others pretended to sip wine. A few avoided eye contact completely. Every second of silence confirmed the same brutal truth: her humiliation had become easier for them to tolerate than defending her. Claire felt heat rising inside her chest, but years of military discipline kept her expression calm. She refused to cry in front of them. She refused to beg for understanding from people who had already decided who she was, long before that dinner ever began. Yet beneath that controlled exterior, old memories were crashing through her mind. Birthdays where her accomplishments were ignored. Family parties where conversations stopped the moment she mentioned military service. Holidays where her siblings were celebrated, while she was treated like the difficult child who never fit the image her parents wanted to present to the world. Suddenly, all those moments connected together. This dinner was not the beginning of the rejection. It was simply the first time the rejection had become impossible to hide. Her father pointed toward the door again, his voice colder now. "Leave." Claire looked at her mother one last time, silently hoping for even a small sign that someone cared enough to stop this. But Susan Bennett only adjusted her napkin and whispered, "Please don't make this more dramatic than it already is." That sentence hurt more than the yelling, because it revealed how completely her pain had been reduced to an inconvenience. Claire slowly reached for her keys near the entrance hallway and began walking toward the door. She counted every step, because numbers gave her something solid to focus on, while everything else inside her threatened to collapse. 23 steps from the dining room to the exit. 23 steps away from a family that had spent years teaching her she would only deserve love once she became someone easier to display. When she finally opened the front door, humid Florida air rushed inside as thunder cracked across the sky. Claire paused for half a second, fighting the urge to turn around one last time. Part of her still hoped someone would follow her. Her brother, her grandfather, anyone. But nobody came, and that silence followed her, all the way into the storm. If you've ever known what it feels like to stand completely alone in a room full of people, make sure to like and subscribe, because Claire's story is only getting started, and what happens next will leave her entire family speechless. What nobody at that dinner table understood was that Claire Bennett had already won long before her father threw her out of the house. While her family spent years treating her like the least successful person in the room, Claire had been quietly building a financial empire, powerful enough to shock every single one of them. And the most unbelievable part, she never told anyone. Not because she was ashamed, but because somewhere along the way, she realized that people reveal their true character when they think you have nothing to offer them. As Claire drove away from her parents' mansion through the stormy Florida night, her phone sat untouched beside her. Messages from family members appeared one after another, but she ignored them all. None of them knew that the woman they had just humiliated was secretly worth tens of millions of dollars. Years earlier, during one of her overseas deployments, Claire began noticing patterns most investors completely missed. Working inside military intelligence gave her a front-row seat to the future of modern warfare. She saw how cybersecurity drone systems, battlefield AI, and defense infrastructure were rapidly becoming more valuable than traditional weapons. While Wall Street chased trends, Claire quietly studied technology companies connected to military innovation. She invested carefully at first, using money saved from years of service. Then she became more aggressive. Every deployment taught her something new about how governments would spend money in the future. Every classified briefing strengthened her understanding of where global security was heading next. Over time, her investments exploded in value. Defense startups she backed early suddenly became billion-dollar companies. Cybersecurity firms she quietly purchased shares in were acquired by massive corporations. What started as disciplined investing slowly transformed into extraordinary wealth. By the time her family sat judging her around that dinner table, Claire's portfolio had already crossed $35 million. Yet nobody suspected a thing, because Claire intentionally kept her life private. Her parents believed she lived in a modest apartment near the military base. Her father assumed she struggled financially because she never flaunted expensive jewelry, luxury vacations, or designer clothing. But Claire understood something: her family never did. Real power rarely needs to announce itself. She bought a stunning waterfront mansion through a private company, so her name would never appear publicly connected to the property. She paid cash. She owned a private dock, a luxury boat, and enough financial security to walk away from almost anything. Yet she continued serving in the military, because money had never been the center of her identity. Freedom was. Freedom to make choices without begging for approval. Freedom to leave toxic environments without fear. Freedom to build a life completely on her own terms. That night, after finally arriving home, Claire sat alone inside her quiet oceanfront mansion, while rain slid across the glass windows, overlooking the water. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to fully accept a painful truth. The people who underestimated her never truly knew her at all. They only knew the small version of her they felt comfortable controlling. But the real Claire Bennett was far more powerful than anyone in that family could possibly imagine. And very soon the entire world was about to find out. What would you do if your own family completely underestimated you? Comment your opinion below, because Claire's next move changed everything forever. Claire Bennett expected to feel broken after being thrown out of her parents' house. Instead, the moment she crossed the private bridge leading toward Marco Island, she felt something far more dangerous beginning to grow inside her. Freedom. The storm clouds above Florida were slowly drifting apart as her black SUV moved through the quiet coastal roads, headlights reflecting across wet pavement. Behind her, she had left a dining room filled with judgment, humiliation, and conditional love. Ahead of her stood a life her family knew absolutely nothing about. At exactly 1014 that night, the gates of her waterfront estate opened automatically as Claire drove onto the curved stone driveway, lined with palm trees and soft golden lights. The mansion rose beside the ocean, like something hidden from the world. Towering glass windows, white stone walls, black iron balconies, and a private dock stretching into the dark water beyond. Most people in her family believed Claire rented a tiny apartment near a military base because that version of her made them feel superior. None of them knew she had purchased this 7-bedroom estate years earlier through a private company using cash. As Claire stepped out of the SUV, warm ocean air wrapped around her while the last traces of rain disappeared into the night breeze. For the first time since leaving the dinner table, she allowed herself to stop pretending she was fine. She sat inside the parked vehicle for several silent minutes, gripping the steering wheel, while years of emotional exhaustion finally crashed into her all at once. Claire did not cry because of the money or the insults. She cried because deep inside a part of her had spent years hoping her father would someday look at her the same way he looked at her siblings, with pride, certainty, and love. But standing there in the darkness, beside a mansion she owned outright, Claire slowly accepted a painful truth. Richard Bennett never wanted to understand the woman she had become. He only wanted a version of her that fit neatly into his world. Claire eventually walked barefoot through the massive glass doors into the quiet luxury of the house. Marble floors reflected soft lights from the ocean outside while waves crashed gently beyond the terrace. Everything around her represented independence. No one had given her this life. No inheritance built it. No family connections created it. Every dollar, every investment, every sacrifice had come from her own discipline and vision. Yet despite the beauty surrounding her, the house still felt strangely empty that night. Success could buy security, but it could not erase years of emotional rejection. Claire poured herself a glass of bourbon and stepped onto the terrace overlooking the dark Gulf waters. Then her phone buzzed again. An official email from the Department of Defense appeared across the screen confirming her attendance at a prestigious National Veterans Gala in Washington. The message informed her that Lieutenant General Raymond Holt would publicly announce her appointment to the Defense Innovation Advisory Council in recognition of her work in military cybersecurity and veterans advocacy. Claire stared silently at the screen, while the ocean wind moved softly around her. In exactly 2 weeks, her name would appear beside some of the most respected military leaders in the country. The same family who had just thrown her away still believed she was lost, unstable, and wasting her life. A quiet laugh escaped her lips as she looked across the dark water. For years, Claire had searched desperately for approval from people incapable of giving it. But standing there beneath the night sky, she finally realized something that changed her forever. She no longer needed anyone's permission to become exactly who she was meant to be. 3 days after Richard Bennett threw his daughter out of the house, his entire world began collapsing because of a single headline. It happened inside the Naples Harbor Country Club, the kind of place where wealthy men measured one another through business deals, golf scores, and carefully curated family reputations. Richard had just finished a round of golf with several attorneys when one of them suddenly stopped beside the clubhouse bar, staring down at his phone with visible confusion. "Richard," the man said slowly, "is this your daughter?" At first, Richard barely looked interested. He assumed it was probably an old military photo or another article about veterans. But the moment the phone turned toward him, the color drained from his face. The headline across the screen read, "Army Intelligence Officer Quietly Builds Multi-Million-Dollar Defense Technology Portfolio." Beneath it was a professional photograph of Claire Bennett standing confidently beside a retired 4-star general during a cybersecurity conference in Arlington. She wore a dark blazer, spoke calmly at a podium, and looked nothing like the unstable disappointment Richard had spent years describing to people in his social circle. The article revealed that Claire had quietly become one of the most influential private investors in defense technology and military cybersecurity. It described her early investments in drone infrastructure, battlefield AI, and intelligence systems years before the market exploded. It mentioned her ownership stakes in multiple companies connected to national security innovation. And then came the number that completely shattered Richard Bennett's understanding of his own daughter. Estimated portfolio value, $35 million. According to Ethan, who later heard the story from one of the club members, Richard stared at the screen so long that the bartender eventually asked if he needed another drink. One of the attorneys laughed awkwardly and said, "Hell of a portfolio your daughter built." Richard responded quietly, "She never told us any of this." But that was the problem. Claire never told them because her family never truly listened. They had spent years assuming they already understood who she was. Within hours, the story spread across Naples faster than gossip ever had before. In wealthy communities, reputation moves like wildfire. Women discussed the article during tennis lessons and charity lunches. Business owners whispered about Claire over expensive dinners overlooking the marina. Someone forwarded the article into a neighborhood social media group, and by evening nearly everyone in Richard Bennett's social circle had seen it. Suddenly the daughter he dismissed as lost became the most fascinating person in town. Then the phone calls began. Claire's mother left a careful voicemail, pretending excitement, while trying to hide embarrassment. Her sister sent a short, cold congratulations message that sounded more jealous than supportive. Meanwhile, Richard stopped attending social events for several days, because every conversation eventually returned to Claire. People no longer looked at him with admiration alone. Now there was curiosity in their eyes, almost judgment. How could a man so obsessed with success completely fail to recognize extraordinary success inside his own family? But the humiliation deepened even further when national media started picking up the story. Television networks praised Claire not only as a decorated Army officer, but also as a self-made millionaire funding veterans programs across the country. That phrase self-made hit Richard harder than the money itself, because it meant Claire achieved everything without his guidance, his connections, or his approval. For the first time in his life, Richard Bennett was forced to confront a truth he never wanted to accept. The daughter he underestimated had quietly become far more respected than he ever imagined possible. The most shocking part of Claire Bennett's story was not the money. It was what she chose to do with it when nobody was watching. As media coverage surrounding her investments exploded across the country, journalists began uncovering another side of Claire that completely changed public perception. Behind the headlines about military intelligence and multi-million-dollar technology portfolios was a woman quietly giving away enormous amounts of her fortune to people society often forgot. And unlike wealthy donors chasing attention, Claire had spent years hiding her involvement. The discovery started with a small veterans rehabilitation center in Virginia. A reporter investigating Claire's business background stumbled across anonymous financial records connected to a nonprofit that provided housing therapy and career support for injured veterans returning from overseas deployments. The donations were massive, consistent, and routed through private trusts that revealed almost nothing about the donor's identity. But after weeks of investigation, one journalist finally traced the funding back to Claire Bennett. Suddenly, the story exploded again. Within days, national media learned that Claire had quietly funded multiple veterans organizations across the country. She paid for prosthetics and advanced rehabilitation treatments that insurance companies refused to fully cover. She funded emergency housing for homeless veterans struggling with PTSD and addiction. She even created scholarship programs for military families who lost parents during overseas missions. And somehow, despite contributing millions of dollars over the years, she never attached her name publicly to any of it. When reporters eventually asked why she hid the donations, Claire answered with a sentence that spread rapidly across television interviews and social media clips. "Some people serve because they want recognition," she said calmly. "Others serve because they remember what sacrifice actually costs." That quote alone transformed her public image overnight. She was no longer seen only as a wealthy military investor. She became something much rarer, a symbol of quiet integrity. Veterans groups praised her openly. Military families began sharing emotional stories online about how Claire's programs changed their lives. One former Marine described sleeping in his car with his children before receiving emergency housing through a foundation secretly funded by Claire. A wounded Army medic revealed that her rehabilitation treatment existed only because Claire covered expenses insurance companies rejected. Every news story made the public admire her more. But inside the Bennett family, the growing attention created a completely different emotion: shame. Richard Bennett watched interview after interview in stunned silence. For years he believed Claire's military career represented wasted potential. Now the entire country celebrated her not only for building wealth, but for using that wealth with compassion and purpose. Even Susan Bennett struggled emotionally after discovering how many struggling veterans personally thanked Claire during televised interviews. One evening she quietly admitted to her husband, "Maybe we never understood her at all." But the most painful realization for Richard came during a late-night news segment featuring General Raymond Holt. The retired general looked directly into the camera and described Claire as one of the most disciplined, intelligent, and selfless people he had ever worked beside. Then he added one sentence Richard could not stop replaying in his mind: "People like Claire Bennett are the reason this country still has honorable leaders." Hearing another man speak about his daughter with such admiration forced Richard to confront something devastating. Strangers seemed to understand Claire's value far better than her own family ever had. And while the Bennett family struggled privately with guilt, the rest of the country continued falling deeper under Claire's quiet influence. If you're enjoying this story so far, staying subscribed means you won't miss the moment the Bennett family finally comes face to face with the full consequences of how they treated her. The night of the Veterans National Leadership Gala became the moment the Bennett family realized they had completely lost control of the story they once believed they owned. Long before Claire Bennett even entered the ballroom in Washington, the atmosphere already carried the energy of a historic event. Military leaders, senators, technology executives, journalists, and decorated veterans filled the enormous crystal-lit hall, while cameras flashed nonstop near the entrance. Across giant digital screens inside the venue, images of military service members rotated beside the words honoring leadership, sacrifice, and innovation. Richard Bennett sat stiffly beside his wife, near the center of the ballroom, visibly uncomfortable inside a room where his daughter's name suddenly carried more weight than his own. He had received the invitation only because Claire personally approved adding her family to the guest list. That detail alone haunted him. Despite everything he said to her, Claire still chose not to publicly humiliate them. Susan Bennett remained unusually quiet throughout the evening, nervously adjusting her bracelet while whispers spread across nearby tables. People were staring, not because of Richard's reputation anymore, but because everyone knew they were Claire Bennett's parents. Then the lights dimmed. The giant screens shifted toward a montage of military operations, cyber defense programs, and veterans' rehabilitation projects funded across the country. Claire's name appeared repeatedly beside footage of soldiers' hospitals and technology facilities. The narrator's voice echoed through the ballroom. Tonight we honor a leader whose influence has quietly transformed both national defense and veterans' advocacy. Richard felt his stomach tighten. He had spent years introducing Claire to people as my daughter in the army, but inside this room, she was being presented as something far larger than a military officer. She had become a national figure. Then came the moment that completely shattered the last pieces of his old perception. The ballroom doors opened, and Claire Bennett walked inside. Conversations stopped almost instantly. Claire wore a black evening gown with minimal jewelry, elegant but controlled, carrying herself with the same calm discipline that once made her family mistake her silence for weakness. But tonight, nobody overlooked her. Senators approached to shake her hand. Generals greeted her with visible respect. Executives moved aside as she crossed the room. Richard watched in stunned silence as powerful people treated his daughter like someone they genuinely admired. For the first time in his life, he realized admiration earned through character looked very different from admiration built through status. Then, Lieutenant General Raymond Holt stepped onto the stage. The decorated officer spoke for several minutes about leadership, sacrifice, and service, before turning toward Claire, seated near the front row. "Major Claire Bennett," he said firmly, "your work in military cyber defense and veterans support has changed thousands of lives. Tonight it is my honor to formally announce your appointment to the Defense Innovation Advisory Council." The room exploded into applause. People rose to their feet across the ballroom while cameras flashed in every direction. Claire stood calmly as the general handed her the official appointment folder. Then unexpectedly Holt added one more statement. "And beyond all titles and achievements, she represents the kind of integrity this country desperately needs more of." Richard lowered his eyes as the applause continued around him. Weeks earlier, he had thrown his daughter out of his house, like she was an embarrassment to the family. Now an entire ballroom filled with national leaders stood applauding her. Susan quietly wiped tears from her face, while Claire remained composed beneath the spotlight. But the most powerful moment came when Claire briefly looked toward her parents across the room. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, no revenge, only distance, and somehow, that hurt Richard Bennett more than public humiliation ever could. Because for the first time he understood that losing respect is painful, but losing emotional access to someone forever is something far worse. Do you think Claire should have forgiven her family after everything that happened? Share your thoughts below, because the final chapter of this story changes everything once again. 5 days after the gala in Washington, Richard Bennett stood outside his daughter's mansion, with a feeling he had not experienced in decades: fear. Not fear of losing money, reputation, or influence, fear that he might already have lost something far more important permanently. The black iron gates slowly opened after Claire's security system confirmed their appointment. Richard tightened his grip on the small gift box in his hands while Susan Bennett sat silently beside him inside the car, staring toward the oceanfront estate ahead. Neither of them spoke during the drive from Naples. There was nothing left to argue about anymore. The truth had already exposed everything. As their vehicle rolled along the curved driveway lined with palm trees, Richard noticed something painful, almost immediately. The house reflected Claire perfectly elegant, disciplined, private, and strong. It was beautiful without trying to impress anyone. For years, he believed success looked like country clubs, political dinners, and public recognition, but Claire had built something entirely different. Peace. The front door opened before they reached it. Claire stepped outside wearing a simple white blouse and dark pants, her expression calm but unreadable. No anger, no warmth either, just emotional distance. That distance unsettled Richard more than shouting ever could. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from waves crashing softly beyond the terrace behind her. Finally, Susan stepped forward first. Her voice trembled slightly. "Claire, thank you for agreeing to see us." Claire nodded once and invited them inside. The conversation that followed became the hardest moment Richard Bennett had ever faced. They sat together in the enormous living room overlooking the Gulf waters, while sunlight reflected across the marble floors. Richard stared around quietly, absorbing details that made him feel smaller with every passing second. Every inch of the house represented a life his daughter built completely without him. No family money, no connections, no approval. Claire offered coffee politely, then sat across from them, with the controlled posture of someone emotionally prepared for disappointment. Richard opened the small box in his hands and revealed a silver military challenge coin that once belonged to Claire's grandfather, Walter. "He wanted you to have this someday," Richard said quietly. Claire looked down at the coin for several long seconds, before carefully taking it into her hands. Her fingers trembled almost invisibly. Richard realized then that despite everything, part of her still cared deeply about the family she had been pushed away from. Susan began crying softly first. She apologized for remaining silent during the dinner. She admitted that fear and comfort had made her weak when Claire needed support the most. Claire listened quietly, without interrupting. Then Richard finally spoke. For perhaps the first time in his entire life, he stopped sounding like a man trying to control a situation. "I was wrong about you," he admitted. The words came slowly, almost painfully. "Not just recently. For years." Claire lowered her eyes toward the coin in her hands, while Richard continued speaking. He confessed that he spent most of her life trying to shape her into someone he understood, instead of appreciating the person she already was. He admitted that her independence frightened him, because it represented something he could never control. The room fell silent afterward. Claire remained quiet for so long that Richard felt panic rising in his chest. Then she finally looked up. "You know what hurt the most?" she asked softly. "It wasn't being thrown out. It was realizing nobody believed I was worth defending." Richard could not answer, because he knew she was right. Claire eventually told them she appreciated the apology and did not want to carry hatred anymore. But she also made something painfully clear. "Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing," she said calmly. "Some things don't go back to the way they were." Richard felt those words land harder than any public humiliation ever had. Because deep down, he finally understood the true cost of how he treated his daughter. Not embarrassment, but distance, that might never fully disappear. One year after Richard Bennett threw his daughter out of the house, he stood quietly at the back of a crowded auditorium, watching Claire Bennett change lives in a way he never thought possible. The building belonged to the newly opened Bennett Veterans Recovery Center, a massive rehabilitation and career support facility overlooking the Florida coastline. Hundreds of veterans, military families, journalists, and local officials filled the room while cameras recorded the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But despite the size of the event, Claire remained exactly who she had always been: calm, disciplined, and focused on other people instead of herself. Richard watched from a distance as wounded veterans approached his daughter one after another, thanking her for helping them rebuild their lives. Some hugged her emotionally. Others simply shook her hand with tears in their eyes. One former Army medic told reporters that Claire's foundation paid for surgeries doctors believed would never happen. Another veteran explained that Claire personally funded his family's temporary housing after he lost everything following deployment. Story after story echoed across the auditorium, and with each one, Richard felt the weight of his past mistakes even more deeply. For years, he judged success by titles, appearances, and status. Claire measured success by impact. And somehow, despite all the pain he caused her, she still chose to spend her life helping people rather than becoming bitter. That realization humbled him more than any public embarrassment ever could. When Claire finally stepped onto the stage, the entire room rose into applause. Behind her, a giant screen displayed the official mission statement of the center: "No veteran left behind." Claire waited patiently for the applause to settle before speaking into the microphone. Her voice remained steady but softer than usual. "There are people in this room," she began, "who spent years believing their sacrifices no longer mattered once the uniform came off. This center exists to remind them they were never forgotten." Silence filled the auditorium as veterans listened closely. Claire continued by explaining that the facility would provide mental health treatment, career placement, emergency housing support, family counseling, and advanced rehabilitation services free of charge for struggling veterans. But then her speech shifted in a more personal direction. "For a long time," she admitted carefully, "I believed that being misunderstood meant I needed to work harder to earn acceptance. Eventually, I learned something important. Your worth does not decrease simply because someone else fails to recognize it." Richard lowered his eyes the moment those words left her mouth, because deep inside he knew part of that message was meant for him. Yet Claire never spoke with anger. She spoke with peace, and that peace somehow made her even stronger. Near the end of the ceremony, reporters asked Claire why she chose to name the facility Bennett Veterans Recovery Center, despite her difficult history with her family. Claire paused briefly before answering. "Because healing matters more than pride," she said quietly. "And because families can either become places where pain grows, or places where healing finally begins." Richard felt tears fill his eyes for the first time in many years. Not because his daughter had become wealthy or famous, but because despite every reason to walk away forever, Claire still chose compassion over revenge. After the ceremony ended, Richard approached her slowly outside near the oceanfront terrace. The sunset reflected across the water, while guests continued celebrating behind them. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Richard finally whispered the words he should have said long ago. "I'm proud of you." Claire looked at him quietly, emotion flickering softly in her eyes. And for the first time in years, the distance between them no longer felt impossible to cross.